ScreenAgers, welcome back to yet another episode of the Canon, your favorite movie podcast, the one and only movie podcast providing you with a watch list of the most essential movies ever made. My name is Raf. We've got another great episode for you today. Another amazing essential movie. Very excited to be talking about this one. It is an absolute classic, and I'm very excited to welcome on to the show a new guest, a new friend. We've got Jason Christian from the Cold War Cinema podcast. Very excited to have you on. Jason, how's it going?
It's going great. Thanks for inviting me on. I'm really excited to talk about this excellent movie. How are you doing?
I'm swell. I'm having a swell day. Also very excited to talk about this movie. Before we get into Casablanca itself, and I'm sure there will be a whole lot for us to talk about there. As I mentioned, you are a member, co-host, main host of the Cold War Cinema podcast. So for those who maybe aren't familiar with it, if we have any listeners out there who haven't checked out the show yet, what's the idea there? Why don't you tell us a little bit about the show, what it is that you guys do there, and what you're talking about and covering?
Yeah, it's a relatively new podcast. We launched January 1st of this year, 2024. And the idea is to look at movies made during the first couple of decades of the Cold War. So early, from the late 40s through the 50s into the 60s. And we're just kind of looking at what they're about and how they reflect some of the politics of the time. It was a really, fraught period here in the U.S. and around the world. And we're just getting into that, and we're kind of analyzing the films, and we're talking about a little bit about the director's biography and a lot of historical context surrounding some of the films. And so the first season, we put some parameters on it, and every film that we're covering was directed by a Hollywood director who was blacklisted. And that blacklist lasted from the late 40s till around 1960. So we're focusing on one film per episode, but we're talking about it at length, kind of like we're doing today, and talking about a lot of historical context. We're about to wrap. Well, you have 2 or 3 episodes left of this season, and we're going to wrap it up. And then we're going to look at Soviet films and
Nice.
some more kind of propagandistic American films throughout the 50s, mostly, next season. And then third season, we're going to branch out and look at like global stuff around the world that
Awesome.
tie into those themes. So yeah, pretty exciting.
Awesome. Yeah, I love that. I like the idea of like breaking it up into different seasons too, to sort of like explore different avenues and just like films from around the world and get like sort of all perspectives of what was going on there, just because that's, that feels like a very rich time in cinema history. And as we'll, get into with this movie itself, like it's very much so, it's hard to sort of remove film history from like global world history or like history of like these nations specifically. So like if we just want to think about American movie history or like Hollywood film history, the backdrop of the Cold War did inform a lot of movies and how they were being made and like what they were about during that time period. So that that sounds awesome. I got a chance to listen to some of the show. I will say for any of our screenagers out there, or listeners to this show who are interested in adding some new movie podcasts to your listening queues, Cold War Cinema is definitely worth the listen. Very informative, very engaging conversation. So I would highly recommend checking it out.
Thank you.
Do you have a favorite episode that you've done so far?
Well, the latest episode was on Salt of the Earth, and that was one of my favorite episodes for sure. It's hard to say. I think we did an episode a little while back on Catch Me If You Can. Not Catch Me. Not Catch Me If You Can. What is the name of that? He Ran All the Way. He Ran All the Way.
Okay.
I always mess up that name, which is a great film, and we did several films starring John Garfield, like 3 in a row, and he's just one of these underrated American actors these days. And he was also blacklisted and died of a heart attack right right after his last film was released in around 1951. So anyway, we get into a lot of those historical details. I would say that's a good episode. I think that was his last film. He Ran All the Way, which is directed by John Barry. I believe that's his last one.
Very nice. I've not seen that movie, but I need to add that to my watch list. Is Cold War cinema, is that your only like movie related project? I feel like I saw that you also write about film some. Do you want to talk about some of the work that you're doing around that as well?
Yeah, I haven't written a lot about film. I've written maybe 3 or 4 essays about different films, but I want to start writing more. And one of my co-hosts, well, both of my co-hosts and I are hopefully going to edit an anthology of essays. I won't say much more than that at this point, but one of my co-hosts is in the PhD program at Duke University, and just a really brilliant scholar. And the other one is just also very knowledgeable about film and film history and film criticism. So we all have this kind of academic background.
Mm-hmm.
And so we want to do more editing of possibly books, and I want to keep writing about film.
Nice.
I'm reviewing a book about film right now that should be out by the time this episode airs, probably, for a Los Angeles Review of Books. It's called Revolution in 35 Millimeter, and it's kind of just a history of interesting revolutionary films from the 60s and 70s, mostly around the world. So it's like right in my wheelhouse. I'm really interested in like seeing how film is responding to historical events as they're happening. And that's why I picked Casablanca, because that's exactly what's going on. It's like, it's very much responding to events happening immediately right around that time. So
yeah, that's really interesting. And now that we're, able to like actually talk about it out loud, after having, been able to listen to some of your show and just get some more, sort of background about your particular, interest and focus within film and film history and all that stuff. This totally makes sense in terms of like the movies that we've had lined up for this season for you to come on and like talk to us about. I feel like this is one of the perfect or more perfect matches of a movie and guest that we've had so far. So I am very excited to get into the movie itself. Quickly, before we start talking Casablanca, just in case folks are interested in listening to Cold War cinema or anything like that, where can they find you?
I mean, it's on it's on Spotify, it's on Apple, it's on all the podcast platforms. I don't have any social. Well, I do have a Twitter account, which is deactivated at the moment. I have a website, jasonchristianwrites.com, and I do write too, and I teach writing for a living. So I kind of go back and forth between literature and film.
Nice.
But yeah, if you just Google Cold War Cinema Podcast, it'll probably pop up.
Awesome. And check out the website as well if you're looking for some good writing. Sweet. So to get us started on Casablanca itself, I feel like there will definitely be a lot of things that we will want to get to with this movie, but in order to just like kick off the conversation to get things going, I do just want to get a sense of sort of like your overall relationship to this movie, like your first time watching it, sort of initial thoughts, and then maybe how many times you have been able to revisit. And then if there was anything like different or new that stood out to you this time that you maybe weren't, picking up on or, reading in, some of your initial watches.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly when I first saw it. I was thinking about this, and I think I had seen. There's so many iconic one-liners in this film that I definitely had seen some clips and things from as a kid, but I think I might have seen the film for the first time all the way through, maybe in high school, which is when I kind of got into cinema, like kind of started taking it seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of those movies that grew on me though over time. I mean, I liked it, but I didn't really get it the first time I saw it. I was too young, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't understand the historical context. I was too young to appreciate kind of the subtle dynamics between some of the characters.
Mm-hmm.
And, I've watched it a bunch of times over the years. I actually taught this film to some high school students in downtown New Orleans. I used to teach high school in New Orleans,
Nice.
and I taught film studies and creative writing. And a couple of students liked it, but a lot of them were
Mm-hmm.
like, "This is boring."
Yeah. Yeah.
and so there was mixed reviews. Some of them did really like it though. So I got to kind of spend more time with it at that point. I think I actually started analyzing it because I had to teach it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then I rewatched it yesterday, and one thing that I was struck by is just how beautiful it is. The
Yeah.
black and white photography is really good,
Yeah.
and the pacing and the editing is sharp. I was just really impressed because with my podcast, it's kind of incentivized me to watch a whole lot of movies from the 40s and 50s, Hollywood movies.
Mm-hmm.
And as some of them, like I mentioned, He Ran on the Way. That's a good film, and I really like it. It's a film noir, and I've watched a lot of film noir from the 40s and 50s, and a lot of them are really interesting at the plot level and pretty cool black and white photography. But this film really, it's like very polished in a way
Yeah.
that's rare. Actually, it really does stand out as incredible, and it holds up in so many ways. So I guess I was just appreciating the artistry of it more yesterday when I was watching it.
Yeah. It is really interesting to think or to like watch this movie and see all those things that you're seeing, like how polished the photography and editing and sort of like those technical aspects are. Because when you think about Casablanca, like you don't necessarily think about this movie as being something that was like a huge leap forward in terms of like the language of cinema. Like it didn't like reinvent or play with the language in any sort of like interesting or revolutionary ways. Not to say that it's not polished, but like reading about some of the like production aspects of this movie, like it was totally just seen as, okay, this is another just movie that is like within the Warner Bros system. Like we're bringing in this director who has directed like, several dozen movies in the last decade. Like he's just a workhorse. He's not, this person who you turn to when you want like the most, epic film that we can put out there. It was just sort of like, yeah, this is another movie along the line, and something about it just like really clicked. Like everything was sort of there, and it really does. Like you watch this movie in 2024, and you're like, "Holy shit, this is this is amazing!" Like the way that it looks, the way that it moves, the way that it feels, the way that you can like easily connect with the characters, and the story is like all like pretty flawless. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, I agree. It's I do think that if you're new to classic cinema, like classic Hollywood cinema, this is a good entry point
Mm-hmm.
because there are some other classic Hollywood cinemas that don't hold up as well. And you can find you can critique it through a gender lens or other lenses, but it's remarkable how well it holds up. And if you really are just paying attention to it and you're setting aside a couple hours, I would say it's one of the best films to kind of get started with classic Hollywood cinema, like the golden age of Hollywood cinema. This is be one of the entry points, but like you said, it wasn't. I mean, it was. They did go over budget, and it wasn't like a B movie necessarily,
Mm-hmm.
but it was just another. There were a lot of World War II war films being made at that time. They were churning them out,
Yeah.
but it had
It's
some big stars, so it was. They did put some effort into this.
yeah,
So
absolutely. The the notion of this being like one of, if not like the sort of best example of a like golden era classic Hollywood movie for someone to check out if they're like just getting into that is pretty interesting. So like obviously the whole question here at the Canon that we want to answer is like, why is X movie essential? So when we're thinking about why is this movie in particular essential, it's you know, I like to think about it in terms of like, what movies should you watch when you are just getting into cinema and you're like trying to build out your like initial roster to then dive deeper. So this, if you're looking to get into classic Hollywood stuff, this is your entry point, and then from there you will then like be able to branch out to a whole bunch of other movies that were coming out around this time. And watching this movie first, you'll have like a better idea of what's going on there, or like what to appreciate and what to not appreciate from some of those other films. Um, in terms of where we should go next, I think I want to ask you about the character dynamics and like the star power within this movie, because I feel like that's a big reason for its like lasting appeal. So why don't you give us just like your thoughts on the character dynamics and the Bogey and Bergman of it all?
okay. Well, can I just quickly summarize sort of what's going on, the plot, in
Oh
one
yeah,
sentence?
please.
So like what it's about is it's set in Casablanca, which is a city in Morocco, and it was made, in 1942, or it was released in 42. I guess it was made in 42 as well. And
Hmm.
what it's about is Humphrey Bogart plays a character named Rick, and he owns a bar in Casablanca, and it's one of these bars where expatriates hang out, military people hang out, businessmen hang out. It's one of those really hot spots where everybody hangs out, and there's kind of a secret casino in the back. I'm not sure it's secret, but there's a gambling place, and it's just kind of like the place to be in Casablanca for a
Hmm.
certain kind of foreigner or expat. And so he owns this bar, and Ingrid Bergman is his love interest, and she plays this character named Ilsa, and then there's going to be some spoilers here, I guess.
Can we spoil a movie that is over 80 years old?
Yeah. So like her partner, well, her husband, Victor Laszlo, is played by Paul Henreid, uh, and they show up to town and they're trying to escape. And so what's going on is people are in real life. People were fleeing Germany and all of Europe, of course, during World War II and leading up to World War II. After Hitler took over Germany, and then they invaded, Poland and Czechoslovakia and different countries, and later France, occupied France.
Hmm.
People were fleeing because they knew they were in danger. Either they were Jewish or some other reason they needed to get
Yeah.
out of there. And
Yeah.
so,
Sometimes people just don't like living in war zones.
yeah, right.
Wild concept.
Yeah, right. And so they were trying to flee, and they had so the all of this context is sort of outlined in the first 5 minutes. It's a really cool kind of interesting montage as the film opens, and they
Hmm.
show that people, and there's a map, and they show like this route, and people are making their way to Casablanca, flying to Portugal,
Hmm.
and then they're flying from Portugal to the US. And of course, people are flooding into, Ellis Island and other places, and going to other places like South America as well. But they're trying to escape the Nazis. So that's the context of the film, right? That's what's going on. And uh, Paul Henreid, who plays Victor Laszlo, he is a he's a leader of the Czech resistance. So, Czechoslovakia, which was a country that no longer exists, but was occupied and invaded by Nazi Germany, and there was a resistance movement. There were people that were trying to stop the Nazis and trying to sabotage their effort and that sort of thing.
Hmm.
So Victor Laszlo is a resistance leader, and there was the French resistance, and there were other resistance movements all over Europe. And
Hmm.
so he's connected to all those people, and he's a folk hero.
Yeah.
He's known to have been caught by the Nazis and escaped a concentration camp, like uh, I think they said 3 times. So he's got this. His reputation precedes him, and so he shows up to town with Ilsa, and they end up at Rick's saloon because everybody's there, and and this is and and when Humphrey Bogart's character, Humphrey Bogart is Rick, he sees her. It's like he's he's shook, because what we find out is a couple of years previously they had a brief affair in Paris, and she was supposed to. And the very day that the Nazis occupied Paris, they fled. They were supposed to flee together on a train, but she didn't show up. She stood him up, and he left Paris and ended up down in Casablanca. So that's some
Hmm.
backstory that comes to the surface whenever she shows up to his bar, and she's as surprised as he is to see him. She doesn't even know he's the owner. She doesn't know he's the Rick of Rick's
Yeah.
Cafe
He
or
went by
whatever.
Richard, right, when they were together. Yeah.
Yes. And so what you see there is this kind of strange love triangle where he's still embittered and uh, obviously in love with her, and she has complicated feelings because she loves her husband, but she also has feelings for Rick. And just what comes out later is we find out she didn't betray her husband. She thought he had been killed. She thought he had been killed in a concentration camp, and she kind of got swept up in this like really brief affair of like a few
Hmm.
days.
Yeah.
And then later she realizes he's alive. He enters back into her life, and she had kind of moved on with her life until all of this comes to the surface when she's in Casablanca. And the reason why they're in Casablanca is they're trying to get these coveted exit visas. They're trying to
Hmm.
get this way to get out of the country because the Nazis are on the trail of Victor Laszlo. So the and you know the in fact the not a Nazi commander shows up right around that time. So there's some interesting scenes where they're literally talking back and forth, this Nazi commander and Victor Laszlo. He's not hiding. He's openly
Hmm.
hanging out using his real name. He doesn't necessarily expect to see these Nazis there. So that's some kind of summary of. There's more to say about the plot, but that's kind of some key
Yeah.
points.
Thanks for that summary. I was just ready to dive in. I'm assuming everyone's seen Casablanca and they know what's going on, and we could just, but I think that summary was super helpful, just in case there's anyone listening who either hasn't seen it, which if you haven't, pause this, go watch it, come back to it, or someone who, hasn't seen it in quite some time and maybe needed a reminder of sort of everything that's going on. But while I was listening to you give us that summary, a lot of other things popped into my mind. So I do want to us to, maybe we'll put a pin in the dynamic between the different characters. Um, but the other thing that came up while you were going through the summary is obviously like the historical backdrop of this movie, which when it was made wasn't historical, like it was present day backdrop, which super interesting. And I do want to come back to that as well. But the last thing that I was thinking of was just sort of like how like tight this screenplay is in
Mm-hmm.
terms of like when you were telling us all of the background info about like why people are in the city of Casablanca, and how that's communicated to us in like 5 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And that is like a testament to how good the screenwriting was here. And I think between the like pacing that you were talking about, which a lot of that can be attributed to uh the folks who are working in the editing room, but I think a lot of it is also due to how clean this screenplay is. Like it moves so effortlessly
Mm-hmm.
throughout the story. Do you have any more thoughts for us, like on how effective this is as like a screenplay, and maybe just like a great teaching moment for or teaching movie for anyone who wants to get into script writing?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I'll say is it was adapted from a play, and
Hmm.
so it was already kind of written and tested, so to speak, on the stage, and so there's a lot of dialogue. Plays typically rely on a lot of dialogue. Uh, there is a lot
Hmm.
of dialogue in this film, and so much of the dialogue is incredibly quippy, very clever. And a lot of the dialogue um, is both, interesting and reveals particulars of the character who spoke the words, but it's also
Hmm.
they're able to achieve some kind of exposition in the dialogue without being overly expository. So they do, you know, sprinkle out facts that you need to know here and there in the dialogue, and there's a lot of communication achieved in the dialogue, and so I would say it's just
Hmm.
some of the best dialogue written from that time, in classic Hollywood films.
Yeah, the dialogue here is great. I think the way that the dialogue is written is, to me, I think sort of just thinking about like classic cinema or really cinema up to maybe like the well, there was some of this in the 60s, but really like 70s, maybe a little bit 80s and then 90s, where we became like really, really obsessed with writing and acting performances being like super naturalistic and like being like a real reflection of the way that people communicate and act sort of in their real lives, which to me can be, super impressive and enjoyable in certain movies. But there is also something that's really enjoyable about watching like really captivating actors read lines that are very much so lines of dialogue.
Yeah.
um,
Hmm.
where you can tell that like whoever wrote them was like really proud of the sentence that they put together, and then whoever is acting it is really excited with like reciting those lines, as opposed to, I don't think that Bogey and or the guy who plays Louis, like I don't think that they were like necessarily interested in understanding the full um like psyche of those characters. They were just like, oh, here are some cool lines for me to read, and I'll try to read it this way versus this way. And I don't know, I think to me there's something that is like really enjoyable and almost like kind of like a lost art in terms of what writing and acting can be as like a creative expression, as opposed to just like trying to reflect the real world.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I always think of I always say and kind of think of it this way, that you kind of have to grade classic Hollywood on a curve,
Hmm.
because they had some things to contend with that aren't necessarily the case in other parts of the world at the same time. One of those is the Hays Code, the Hayes production code that put a
Mm-hmm.
lot of limitations on what they could and couldn't do. They couldn't, you know, portray too much sex on the screen. They couldn't endorse crime, so the criminal always had to be punished in the end. There's a lot of different prohibitions with the Hayes Code. Of course, it was a different time, but one of the things that they did is you really can see this heavy hand of the writers sometimes in the dialogue,
Mm-hmm.
and audiences were kind of primed for that and okay, presumably okay with that. And I feel like the big game changer, one of the things that really changed everything was, uh, oh yeah, A Streetcar Named Desire. The performance by so Elia Kazan directs that, and the
Mm-hmm.
performance by Marlon Brando. Jeez, that's who I was trying to think of.
There we go.
Marlon Brando single-handedly changed what acting was going to be. He was like
Yeah.
a true method actor, and
Yeah.
so before that, this was what acting looked like. And so, but it's masterful. They do about as good a job as you can do, I think, in Casablanca for that time.
Absolutely. Not Streetcar Named Desire. The one that always pops into my head is, oh my god, now I'm blanking on it. The other big Kazan Marlon Brando movie.
Oh,
On the waterfront.
on the
When
waterfront, yeah.
yeah, like the moment where he like picks up the glove and just like continues to read his lines like through that or recite his lines. I feel like that's like the moment where everyone was like, "Oh my god, acting is is
Marlon
changed forever."
Marlon Brando was a force of nature. He was
Yeah.
like a planet unto himself. He was just an unbelievable actor.
uh,
So anyway,
so yeah, we could definitely get bogged down in the Brando of it all, but we do have in this movie another one of the best leading men in American cinema history in Humphrey Bogart. How do you feel like the movie, how does this movie sort of like highlight his essence and his skill as a performer, an actor, a screen presence, at this time and, for forever?
yeah, I've seen quite a few. I've seen a lot of Humphrey Bogart films, and he really, it's like this part was created for him.
Mm-hmm.
I think it does showcase his talents better than almost any um, of his films. He's really good at portraying somebody who's embittered and
Mm-hmm.
cynical, but is kind of disingenuous in that portrayal. Like you can see through the cracks of his facade just ever so slightly, and he allows himself some humanity by the end of the film and here and there within the film, and he just nails the part. And it I one of the coolest aspects of this film is his reputation in Casablanca,
Mm-hmm.
like Victor Laszlo, precedes his appearance. So we
Mm-hmm.
hear about Victor Laszlo before we see him, and we hear about Rick before we see him, and we hear about him quite a bit. We're actually spending quite a bit of time in the club before
Yeah.
we see him, and you don't see his face yet. You see a hand signing a check with his name, and you're like, "Oh, that must be Rick signing the check." And then
Yeah.
then the camera follows from his hand up to his arm, and then you finally see his face, and he's wearing a white tuxedo. He's not smiling. He's like no nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
He's clearly the man in charge, but also the man that most people would be kind of intimidated to approach.
Yeah.
And he just absolutely nails that part. What's interesting is he's a little guy. He's not. He's like maybe 5'6",
Oh,
very
really?
very short, very small frame.
Mm-hmm.
He's not a very large person at all. Like he probably weighs 130 pounds or something. Maybe 5'7", but he's a small framed short man, but he has this very large presence
Yeah.
on the screen.
That's really interesting. I would have assumed that he was a bigger guy. He he doesn't present as having, you know, a small stature or frame really. Um, Interesting. I always talk to people about like tall faces versus short faces,
Mm-hmm.
and to me, Humphrey Bogart has a pretty tall face. I would have assumed like, you know, 5'11", 6 foot, but that like totally just like shook my world hearing that.
I need to do some fact checking on myself just to double check that he's not like accidentally 5'8".
5'8", yeah,
Yeah,
which is still, you know, not like the as big as his presence.
yeah. He also has this unmistakable voice. You know, he's one of
Mhm,
those Hollywood actors that you hear his voice and you just know who it is, and it's been imitated by comedians, you know, for decades now,
mhm.
and it's very raspy, and it's really hard to describe what his voice is like, but it's raspy, and it, you know, I think he's probably a New Yorker, um,
Yeah.
and yeah, he is, and yeah, like I said, he's always smoking. He's chain smoking constantly,
Yeah. I
and
mean,
I'm,
that's
yeah,
how we get the nickname for. I don't know if you've ever heard someone refer to a cigarette as a bogey, but
oh,
from
right,
good old Humphrey, where we get that. So I think you brought up something interesting about the character of Rick and sort of how this character is perfect for what Humphrey Bogart was able to bring to the table, and sort of, you know, vice versa. Humphrey Bogart was kind of like the only person who could really embody someone like Rick, and I think that sort of that cynicism, but there are cracks within the cynicism that we can tell that there is a sort of like gentle core that we can get at.
hmm,
And I feel like a lot of his like noir performances, so like, you know, you think of something like Maltese Falcon or whatever, where that's just like those roles are typically just like straight cynicism without many cracks for us
hmm,
to sort of find the gentle side. And I think that because this movie and this role does allow him to show that, whether, you know, knowingly or unknowingly, I think that really just like heightens the performance to probably his most iconic role. Um, in terms of the character of Rick and like that cynicism, do you think that the movie itself sort of shares that view outlook on the world and life, or do you think that this is maybe more of a happy, optimistic movie?
that's a good question. I think partly why we like this movie, I think what one reason why this movie has lasted is there's enough evidence from his character's behavior to project kind of whatever you want onto him. So
Mm-hmm.
if you're an optimist, then you see him as an optimist. If you're cynical, you can see him as a cynic because he's described by other characters as cynical.
Mm-hmm.
And then he's also described as kind of a secret sentimentalist, which he
Yeah.
also is. And so he's one of those characters that is what people would say nuanced, or he contains multitudes, really.
Yeah.
And 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 I think because of that, you can get almost anyone to kind of like his character. And it's not like he only does great things. He does some kind of bad things too. He's not very good to this woman that he's
Mm-hmm.
dating. He's domineering. He is cynical and embittered. But what you find out is he's embittered because he fell in love with the woman and she ran out on him. And you know, that is somewhat relatable. You know, it may not be justified, but people can, you know, people grieve heartache
Mm-hmm.
in strange ways, right?
Yeah.
And so I think he's open enough to interpret almost any way you want. I think the film is ultimately optimistic. I mean, it is it is let's just say, I mean, it came out right after, so the US enters the war after Pearl Harbor, which was
Mm-hmm.
December 7th, 1941. So this movie comes out less than a year after that. And so the U.S. has just entered the war. And in fact, they timed the release of this film a week ahead of the U.S. invading Casablanca and recapturing it. So
Hmm.
it's like very much was released in timing with a U.S. military campaign,
Yeah.
which is incredible, insane.
Yeah. That's
uh,
wild.
so, American audiences were always being pushed and pulled in various directions depending on what was on the big screen. And the US government was constantly involved in helping shape films at the time. And the US entered this unlikely and strange alliance with the Soviet Union right around that time also. And so if you notice, there's a Russian character in the film. And
Hmm.
this, we think of the US being at odds with the Soviet Union because we entered the Cold War a little bit later. But there was a 4-year period when the US allied with the Soviet Union against the Axis powers, against Nazi Germany and fascist Italy right around this time. So they were making a bunch of pro-Russian films in Hollywood. And so there was a girl from Bulgaria in the film, and there was this Russian guy, and they were sympathetic characters. And that was
Hmm.
a signal that Russia's our friend right now, I think. But anyway, I kind of lost my train of thought on the. Oh,
Whether, yeah.
I think it is optimistic because it's essentially it should. I think it was designed. It's a love story. It's a story
Hmm.
of good triumphing over evil, that sort of thing. Like it almost
Hmm.
raises to the level of like a Greek tragedy in terms of like the stakes involved,
Yeah.
tragic heroes and characters. But I think the ultimate takeaway would be for an American, like war is ugly and it's not something that we should enjoy or like, but sometimes you have to, sometimes it's the right thing to do. That's how it would be perceived by an audience at that time. And so I think the movie is essentially endorsing the US decision to go to the war because there were a lot of people who didn't think it was a good idea, right?
Hmm.
And so the movie's kind of making the case that this is the right course of action.
Yeah. That our involvement, right, similar to Rick's involvement, as much as you want to be the heartbroken cynical, your involvement ultimately at the end of the day will serve some sort of greater purpose. And then you can go on having the start of a beautiful friendship with Louis. And, things will will sort of, work themselves out at the end of the day. Um,
Can I say something about Louis for a second?
yeah.
So Louis, his name in the film is uh, his name is Louis Captain Louis Renault, or and he is a French uh, police captain, right? I think he's like the head of the police in there, and we should say like Morocco was occupied. Well, it was a colonial country. It was a colony of Spain,
Hmm.
part of it, and the other part was a colony of France. So they're in French Morocco, not
Hmm.
Spanish Morocco. And Renault is kind of the polar opposite of Victor Laszlo. So if Victor Laszlo is like this selfless kind of folk hero trying to fight evil and sacrificing his own life for the good of the people under the thumb of the Nazis. Captain Renault is kind of this opportunistic, has no scruples whatsoever,
Yeah.
will do anything and everything for his own pleasure. He's you could say, a bootlicker. He'll do
Yeah.
anything. Like he's not a nice guy, but he's a charismatic actor. So
Yeah.
Claude Rains plays that character, and he's a really good actor. He's really great for the part. So even though he's this repugnant character, you kind of enjoy watching him on screen, right?
Oh, he's a delight to watch.
Yeah, he's kind of this like almost like Penguin from, well, I don't know who to compare him to, but he's just very charismatic and funny. There's a lot of humor in the film.
Yeah, it's
I,
interesting because like Rick sort of falls in between the two, and there
I
is an element of the movie that is like this constant like push and pull between his sort of what we could probably call like his internal, not desires, but like impulses to lean in the direction of someone like Victor. But because of the heartbreak that he has experienced in the world, he feels that it would be best for him to maybe lean more towards a character like Louis, or, just like shut himself down completely, which could in ways result in actions that are more in line with, with what Captain Renault would do. So it is interesting that he sort of like sits in between the two of them. Like oftentimes we talk about the triangle within this movie of being between Victor. Oh my God, why am I blanking on the name of her
Grub,
character?
Ilsa Lund.
Ilsa. Yeah.
Yeah,
Between Victor, Ilsa, and Rick. But there is this other triangle that exists between those three characters.
I
Um,
agree. Yeah,
yeah.
I 100% agree. And I think of it like this. So Victor represents this kind of 100, admirable, as I said, selfless kind of person that you would write, that would go down in history as a great folk hero. And his foil is this incredibly corrupt police captain, Renault. And I agree that, Rick is a complicated character. He has traits of both of those. That's why he's so compelling, because you,
Hmm.
you want to see how he comes out in the end, right? Because
Yeah.
we want to see what side he falls on. And one of the things about um, the film is he's described. So whenever that Nazi commander shows up to town on the trail of Victor, uh, Renault describes Rick as completely neutral. He's like, see, this guy's completely neutral. He doesn't care about politics. He doesn't care about any of this stuff. And the viewer is probably like, that's probably true. Maybe it's true, but he seems to be a little more complex than that. And what the film is kind of asking us to to come to terms with is you can't actually be neutral when there's Nazis taking over your town or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
Like you kind of have to pick a side, basically.
Yeah.
Uh, and so like when the stakes are that high, neutrality is an illusion. Is kind of the suggestion from the film,
Hmm.
and I love how that plays out in various ways because at one point, um, um, Renault and um, he's talking to Rick and he's like, Rick, I want you to help us. This is before Laszlo even shows up. He's like,
Hmm.
this guy Victor Laszlo is coming to town. I want you to help us, capture him. He's not going to get on a plane to Portugal,
Hmm.
to Lisbon. And he's like, I bet you 10,000 francs that he will. And anyway, they have this discussion, and Rain's character, Renault, he's like, I think you're secretly a sentimentalist. And what he means by that is you secretly have political scruples.
Hmm.
You care about the underdog, and he's like, why do you say that? And he says, well, you ran guns to Ethiopia in 1935. And what that means is Mussolini and the fascists from Italy invaded Ethiopia and tried to conquer Ethiopia. So he was
Hmm.
running guns to the
To the resistance fighters. Yeah.
resistance, the partisans who were fighting
Yeah.
the fascists. And then they said he actually joined the anti-fascists during the Spanish Civil War the next year.
Hmm.
So these are like actual events that just happened a few years ago before the
Hmm.
movie was made, like 6-7 years before the movie was made. People know about these events. And so he's like, yeah, but I did it for the money. He's like, well, it's kind of curious that you didn't do it for the other side. They would have paid you more money. So
Yeah.
so what we're supposed to realize is he's kind of faking his cynicism.
Hmm.
But he truly is embittered. He is embittered because of this romance, but he's not
Yeah.
quite as cynical as he's portraying himself. So
No, and I think that's like the core sort of, not question of the movie, but that is like at its core, like to me, what makes the movie so interesting is, can someone like that truly abandon like all of their, can you actually drop all of your ideals and worldviews because you are so sad that a girl who you knew for a week left you in Paris? Like, is
Yeah.
that actually something that can drive you to the point of like giving up on, fighting the good fight against fascism worldwide?
Yeah.
Um, and it's, I think at the end of the day, like, or at the end of the movie, I think the answer is no. And I think with the ending, we're sort of led to believe that he could never really let go of his ideals and his, sentimentalism, as Louis would say, uh, about the world. But like, then it also is a question of whether it was because he can never let that go, or does he love her so much that he thinks he needs to let her go in order for her situation to be the best, his situation to be the best, and like globally for the world situation to be the best. Like, at the end, is he doing it for love, or is he doing it for love of the game, so to speak, and the game being defeating fascism?
Yeah. Oh, that's what's so brilliant about the writing. There's enough, you could make a case for either, and you would
Mm-hmm.
probably be right, you know. And so it's probably both, right? And that's what's so wonderful about the writing is there's enough you can, yeah, everybody's happy with
Mm-hmm.
Casablanca. Nobody's like, "Oh, I liked it except for this." Most people are like, "I got what I wanted out of this film." It has all the elements. It has political intrigue. It has good versus evil. It has a romance, and
Mm-hmm.
it's all intertwined in such a brilliant way.
Yeah, and you've got this funny side character.
There's a
Um,
lot of humor in the film, actually.
yeah, and I think Humphrey is deceivingly funny. I think what makes some of his line delivery so funny is like they're clearly jokes, but he doesn't deliver them as jokes. It's like still the same Humphrey Bogart delivery that you get for all of his other lines, and
Yeah,
like to me that makes the jokes land like as being way funnier than they probably should be. Like when they're looking at his ID papers and they're like listing all this info about him, and he goes, "Are my eyes really brown?"
yeah,
It's just
yeah.
like his delivery
Deadpan.
is so poor, yeah, it's so deadpan that it
Yeah.
makes it 10 times funnier.
I agree. There's also a pretty funny line. We didn't mention Peter Lorre, but I love Peter Lorre as an actor. Peter Lorre plays this kind of, well, basically, he's a human trafficker, is what he is. He's a person who helps smuggle out refugees,
Hmm.
and he's the one who, in the first place, has these two exit passes or exit visas that Victor Laszlo and um, Ingrid Bergman's character
Ilsa.
in Ilsa end up like using to get out of the country. So that's
Hmm.
what these exit um, visas are, sort of like the MacGuffin, the thing that everybody wants that drives the narrative forward. But anyway, they came originally from Peter Lorre's character, and he's such a kind of like very different kind of character than Bogart. Bogart's so no nonsense, and but anyway, earlier in the film, Peter Lorre's characters, he's like, "You don't really like me very much," and Bogart's sitting there playing chess by himself, smoking, and he's like, if I thought about you, I probably wouldn't like you very much, but." Like that's how much a non-entity he is,
Yeah,
but he says it
that's
so deadpan and straight faced.
so funny. There's so many good lines in this movie. This might be one of the most quotable, or oft quoted movies of all time,
Yeah,
and just ones that
definitely.
just from like existing within the late 20th and 21st century. Like you don't have to see the movie to know, like, of all the gin joints in all the world, she shows up at mine. um
Yeah, or here's looking at you, kid, is just
yeah.
a famous. It's so famous that it's almost hilarious when you finally see it. You're like, oh, that's the line
Yeah,
that's been repeated a million times.
we'll always have Paris, like
Yeah,
it goes on and on. I did want us to circle back to what you were mentioning before about character dynamics, and I feel like we spoke about it a little bit in terms of Rick's relation to Victor and Louis, but in terms of Rick's relation to Victor and Ilsa, and specifically just like the dynamic between the Rick and Ilsa characters, I just was curious to hear, or circle back to what your thoughts are on how that all plays out and like adds to this movie's greatness.
Yeah. So whenever Ilsa shows up to Rick's bar, he goes from being this no nonsense, kind of emotionless, bitter guy
Mm-hmm.
to like very distraught. And whenever Ilsa realizes who he is, we didn't even mention, but Sam is the piano player and he's a great singer. And she says, "Sam, play this tune." And it's actually a wonderful song that's kind of played over and over in the film, and that kind of sends him on a spiral. And then, but it triggers a flashback scene. And
Mm-hmm.
when we see the flashback scene, they're in Paris a couple years before, and it's really remarkable how much. This is why you know that they're actually really good actors. Like he's completely different in Paris. Did you
Mm-hmm.
notice how like he's smiling and he seems
He's
10
he's
years
like,
younger.
there's a vibrance in in his eyes that he loses in all of the scenes in Casablanca. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, he's almost boyish and
Mm-hmm.
but it's, it was filmed at the same time, but he seems 10 years younger and definitely, unencumbered, not cynical. And and I think part of what we're supposed to take away from him in Casablanca, it's not just that he's cynical and heartbroken, it's that he kind of lost some innocence.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like he was somewhat, well, we know he ran guns to Ethiopian partisans and we know he was in the Spanish Civil War, but there seems to be some kind of naivete and innocence attached to him in Paris. And he
Yeah.
thinks she's going to board the train with him. And when he's in Casablanca, he's shattered and just doesn't care about anything but himself, presumably.
Mm-hmm.
And and I really like Ingrid Bergman in this film. I mean, she's a fantastic actress too.
Mm-hmm.
And you realize she has a lot of integrity. And yes, she loved him, but she loves her husband and their cause more. I mean, that's just the facts.
Yeah.
Uh, and she's kind of like, she's not happy go lucky. She's a pretty serious person on the screen. Like, these are serious times, and she has a lot of integrity and dignity. I feel like, and
Yeah.
I like the way that that's shown. Do you have anything to add to that, or?
Not so much. I was just gonna say on her performance specifically, I think definitely right to bring up just like the integrity of the character and how amazing she is at playing that. The other thing that I was sort of reading in terms of like going, and I read sort of conflicting, uh, not reports, but just like uh, I guess it would be reports on how this played out. But by some accounts, she did not know who her character was going to end up with at the end. So a lot of the like uh, conflict and inner sort of turmoil that you see within that character is because like in Bergman's performance, she just like didn't actually know like which way the character was going. So a lot of that uncertainty was like very much so real within her as real as it was for the character.
Hmm.
But then there were also some accounts that I read that said that because of the Hays Code at the time, they couldn't depict a woman leaving her husband for someone else because that's
Right.
that wouldn't be up to the standards of what American family life was supposed to be at the time. I don't know which one is true. I think like either would make for a very interesting kind of like reread or recontextualization of her performance specifically. I don't know if you've heard either way on that aspect of her performance and like the story.
Yeah, I hadn't. heard that particular thing, but I did hear or read that they were writing and revising the script as they were shooting it. So they didn't have every detail figured out at the end. And that makes sense. I mean, her ambivalence is perfect for the character though, because she's supposed to be someone who's in turmoil and torn, right? She's torn between different possibilities. And from a modern point of view in 2024, you might be like, why would she like this embittered man? But you remember, she saw another side of him at her most vulnerable, and
Mm-hmm.
she really did fall in love with him, I think. And it's hard to shake that. Um, and he's, when she asks him to help. She says, "Hey, can you help us get these exit visas?" He's like, "No, I'm not going to help you," because he's so embittered. And
Mm-hmm.
she changes, right? She's like, "You're not the man that I thought you were anymore. Like, I thought you were a decent guy, basically." And he essentially says, "I know I've changed." And she kind of she opens up to Laszlo and explains all the context, because he came to
Mm-hmm.
also and said, "Hey, I'd like to pay you any amount of money you need. I'll give you 100,000 francs. I'll give you,"
Yeah.
and he says, "I wouldn't do it for 3 million francs." And he's like, "Why on earth wouldn't you?" And he says, "Go ask your wife." And so anyway, Ilsa and Victor, they have a conversation. He explains, but Victor's cool with it. He's like, "I get it. You thought I was dead." He's the paragon of moral clarity, right? Like
Yeah.
he's like he's like the perfect human being.
Yeah.
And uh, and essentially, what we see is that Bogart's conscience catches up with him. He can't. He has to let them. He needs to get them out of, let them go. Like, they should be.
Yeah.
And another cool, can I just add, like, another detail that indicates that he's softening up is this young Bulgarian woman is trying also to get out of the country, and get to Lisbon so she can fly to America. And her husband is literally gambling and losing the money. And I think this part is really fascinating because there's a lot of innuendos, but it's clear what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
Renault has this side hustle. This is the level of his corruption. He essentially sleeps with desperate women and helps them get these exit visas. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's implied that this Bulgarian woman has been propositioned to sleep. Renault has propositioned her to sleep with him, and he'll get her and her husband exit visas. And so she comes to um, Rick and says, "Rick, tell me what kind of man Renault is." And Rick says, another funny line, "He's just like any other man, only more of it."
I mean, yeah, that's an amazing line.
That's just hilarious. But she's like, "Is he does he have any scruples? Is he going to honor his word?" And then she essentially says, without saying it, she says, "Would you are a man, would you still essentially love your partner, your wife, if she
Mm-hmm.
did this terrible thing in order to save you?" And it's implied what she's prepared to do.
Yeah.
And then that struck a nerve, even though he doesn't. This is what I like about Bogart. He doesn't reveal. He has the perfect poker face, right?
Yeah.
He doesn't reveal in his face that he is emotionally moved whatsoever. But he deadpan, like poker face, walks into the casino and tells her husband, "Put your money on." He's playing roulette, and he's like, "Put your money on number 22." Lo and behold, it's rigged, and he wins a bunch of money. And then he's like, "Hit it again." He wins a bunch more money. He's like, "Get out of here and never come back." So he essentially saved their lives. Like, imagine, these are refugees, and a month later, they show up to Ellis Island and start over their lives. And now their great grandkids are alive in America because he saved their life. But it's just like a small gesture that almost meant nothing to him as far as his expressions are. But it's an indication that he's not quite as bitter as he had been. But he doesn't let on like anything
Yeah.
matters, you know? And so you already see, oh, he's one of those tough love kind of guys, actually. And you know, moments later, he's able to do a similar thing for Ilsa and Laszlo. Like it's clear he loves this woman, but the facts are that she's married to this man, and it was just one of those things that happens in life. It's bittersweet, and he seems to have kind of overcome his bitterness to some extent, and he's happy to send her off. He saves her life and his life, and they
Mm-hmm.
presumably they get on that plane and fly away, and they start over in the US as well. So I don't know, that's the optimism that ends up coming into the film,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what's so, you know, magnetic about that character is he's able to both be embittered but somehow idealistic at the same time
Yeah.
and choose the right thing. Like he's essentially realizing you can't be neutral. You have to make a choice. And this isn't that hard of a choice when it comes down to it. Like he can make this choice.
Yeah. There. Okay. So this kind of brings us back to sort of the other thing that we have been sort of talking around and through, but this movie being one that was released very early on in the US's involvement in World War II. And I think when we think about World War II movies, most of the more famous examples are ones that came after World War II, where it was very easy to sort of like reapply either, you know, more current or modern day American sensibilities onto our involvement in that war. But this one, because it was made and released like in the midst of the war, um and like now we watch it as, you know, 2024 audience members, it's really hard to like think about it as a movie that was released during the war and not one that has like the benefit of, you know, looking back on it, because all that optimism and stuff is easy to apply, you know, 20 years later, 30 years later, 40 years later when you're making a World War II movie. But that optimism could have like worked out very differently. um
Well,
you know.
there's a scene in the movie where, not to sorry to interrupt, but there's a scene in the movie where Rick is talking to these actual Nazis, these Germans, and he's like, he's not, he's got his poker face. He's not trying to show that he hates them, but he's also not showing them any respect because it's a, you know, it's a the way he operates. And this guy's like, "Why did you leave Paris?" He's like, "It just didn't feel right for me." He's like, "Can you see? Can you see Nazis? Can you see Germans take like? Can you picture in your mind um, the Germans taking over London?"
Yeah.
And then he's like, "Let me know when you get there." And he's like, "How about New York City?" And he's like, "There's certain parts of New York City I wouldn't advise going to." But then
Yeah.
right then there's like a commotion or something happens and it
Hmm.
interrupts the moment. But it's a really interesting scene because you're right. In 1942, for all we know, the Nazis will win the war, and
Yeah.
like it's
They could
really,
have marched on to London. They could have, you know,
and they were
right? Like,
trying.
yeah, they could have, you know, found their way to New York. And if the war, you know,
Yeah,
didn't work out the way that we like now know it to work out, like
right.
we're looking back on Casablanca as a movie and we're like, whoa, that got everything wrong. You know, I think we'd all say, luckily, um, things worked out the way that they did work out. So um, I think that's also like part of why this movie gets to like live on in, you know, eternity for like film history, is because even though it was released during that time, it does very much so read in line with the sensibilities of like World War II movies that we have made here in America post World War II. Um,
Yeah.
like it very much so aligns with those sensibilities that we've come to develop over time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. I agree.
Do you have anything else for us on just like the historical backdrop of this movie and how it like either benefits or, is plays with what it is that we're like actually seeing on the screen?
Well, yeah, just a couple things. So, in the very opening sequence, you see that map and you see, okay, um, this is a way station for people leaving Europe to get away from the Nazis. And what we quickly see, but if modern audience might not realize what's going on. So I just want to clarify: not the Nazis occupied France, and the French just rolled over and said, "Come on in." They
Mm-hmm.
collaborated, and that's called Vichy France. That's the name of
Mm-hmm.
that is Vichy France. But meanwhile, there was a second French government that was operating from London, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Charles de Gaulle and all these people were trying to keep France as a country, like kind of doing operations from England and with the help of England. And
Mm-hmm.
so like again, with the benefit of hindsight from history, and then meanwhile on the ground, the French resistance was sabotaging the Nazis in lots of different ways: car bombs, assassinations, et cetera, et cetera. And so, um, history looks back on Vichy France as, a disgrace and very bad, right? Like they
Mm-hmm.
collaborated with Nazis, and they look back on the French resistance with admiration as being heroic, right? And so that's all just what was going on. And so in the opening sequence, as soon as it gets away from that montage with the map, there's a kind of a newsreel thing where we find out that two Germans are assassinated on a train, and these exit visas are stolen, and they're headed to Casablanca, right? And those are the exit visas that end up in the hands of Ilsa and Victor later. By the way, the exit visa is not even a real thing. It's not. It's just something they made up for the movie. But
Yeah.
anyway, uh, but anyway, that's just the detail. So, so what I wanted to mention is right there in the beginning of that scene, as the movie actually opens after that montage, there's a man that's being stopped by the police, and the police are essentially collaborating with Vichy France. They're like collaborating with the Nazis.
Mm-hmm.
They're not part of the resistance, and they're against the resistance. And so there's a scene where this man's like stopped, controlled by the police, detained, and they say, "Let's see your papers." And he's like, he hands them his papers, and they're like, "Oh, these are expired." And he starts running, and he gets shot in the back.
Mm-hmm.
He gets shot in the back. He falls down, and the police like go over there and search his body, and they find some like basically some information, some like propaganda that's clearly like pro, you know, French resistance. So it's clear that he's a member of the French resistance, right?
Mm-hmm.
What we've kind of already realized is that Casablanca is kind of a hotbed for French resistance people. They're having
Mm-hmm.
meetings, and Laszlo's invited to one of those meetings later. And so when he falls down and dies, he falls down in front of this, this mural of the president of France, who was that leader who just kind of rolled over when the Nazis came in. So it's very symbolic. Petain, or is that his name? Yeah, Petain.
Mm-hmm.
Philippe Petain. I'm not good at French, but essentially he was this very elderly. He was like 80 something, president of France, or prime. I think he's president and chief of state, or prime minister is what he was. But anyway, and then so they show him, and so we're meant to see him as a traitor, a bad leader, and then
Yeah.
this guy just dies at the foot of this mural, and then the camera pans up, swings up, and you see the French motto, which is, I have it written down if I can find it. Too many things on my notes, like liberté, égalité, and
Mm-hmm. Fraternite.
fraternité. I'm not sure that's the correct order, but essentially, this is the French
Yeah.
motto of the country, and so all of that has been obliterated. Like that is the motto, but the motto no longer applies. That's the implication, and so you can blink and miss it if you don't
Yeah.
see that stuff. You can blink and miss it, but a contemporary audience that knew a little bit about what was going on in the world would have known.
Yeah.
And so that's something I wanted to mention.
No, that's all very interesting. I mean, I think this sort of conversation that we're having at the end of this conversation about the movie um, is something that I always find super interesting when revisiting sort of essential movies and trying to uh, understand and like balance out the sort of time and place that the movie was first released and how audiences and just like society at large would respond to what it is that's in the movie versus like how we look at it uh now. And a movie like this where the difference is over 80 years, right? All of the additional context that we have about World War II, America's involvement in it, what the city of Casablanca meant at that time is very different from the like context and knowledge that audience members had in 1942 when they were first going to see it. And like you mentioned, like there were things that were happening at that time that they were more aware of that have maybe been a little lost to history that now as modern audiences we don't understand, like not understand, but we don't pick up on the way that, like you said, contemporary audiences would. And but then there is also like we get to add all this additional context of 80 years of cinema, world history, like all of these things to understanding uh
Mhm.
the movie.
Yeah.
The last question that I want to ask before we just like wrap up our thoughts and go to recommendations and all that is just like, what did you make of the setting of Rick's, like the cafe itself? Because to me, with all of the different like expats and different kinds of characters who find themselves there, it very much so reads like a um what's the word that I'm looking for? It very much so reads as like a stand-in for the US of like, come to Rick's where everyone gets to mingle and involve and be involved, whether you're a French resistance fighter or um you know a literal Nazi, like just come in and have a drink and we'll all just hang out and sort of do our own thing and gamble. But I don't know if you had any thoughts on like what Rick's as a structure sort of like symbolizes within the movie or like means to you within the story in the movie.
Actually, that's a really smart observation, and I hadn't thought of it like that. But I think that's a good observation. Well, we call them refugees, but what they're seeking is refuge. And so
Hmm.
a watering hole like Rick's is a refuge in a literal sense and a figurative sense. So it's like a place where people find comfort, camaraderie. Uh, they're exchanging goods. I mean, there's people selling things on the black market. They're unloading diamonds and trying to get some cash. There's all this activity going on there. There's a black market essentially
Hmm.
operating there. So it's like a multi-use space. It's a refuge. It's a black market. It's a place to get entertained. The music, we haven't even talked about the music. It's fantastic all throughout the film.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's an allegorical stand-in for the U.S. Now, let's just be clear: the U.S. is a complicated place, but this
Yeah.
is the way that the U.S. has portrayed itself in films at the time, right?
Hmm.
Like, um,
Yeah.
and this is
It's what
so
we would like now think of as like just like a place for like a global society to sort of like interact and come together. And not to say that like the US is the only place where that can happen, but right, so much of what we understand of the US is like, come to this country, it doesn't matter where you're from, like we will accept sort of all people and you'll be able to have a safe space here, so to speak. And right, like, so Rick's might not be a stand-in for that exactly, but it is this sort of idea of like a global community being in one place and being able to like interact and live with one another.
Yeah, I agree. I think the self mythologizing that the U.S. had done so much in Hollywood. Hollywood is called a dream factory, and
Hmm.
it was transmitting these kind of ideals in the films very intentionally too, especially during the war. And so, yeah, I think that's a great point that Rix is kind of a stand-in for the sort of way that the U.S. Presented itself and thought of itself at that time.
Yeah.
And people were pouring in by thousands from
Yeah.
Europe. So
I always find that like pretty interesting when watching this movie in particular. You did mention the music. The score here is great. Obviously, Sam's playing and singing of the song, whose name escapes me at the moment, and I'm probably getting yelled at by all of our listeners for forgetting the name of said song. But did you have anything else that you wanted to bring up about the music and sort of how it moves within the movie? I don't know if you had anything else on that.
yeah, well, the singer's name, his real name is Dooley Wilson, and he was actually a jazz drummer, but
Hmm.
he's not really a piano player, but he was acting like one.
Yeah.
And he was the voice though. And yeah, I mean, the music it's a device in the film because it's a way that, well, that signature song that's repeated over and over. It ends up being a way that they, first of all, it triggers a backstory, like a flashback scene.
Yeah.
But it's also used as a way for them to kind of non-verbally communicate their love or their lost love.
Hmm.
And there's a moment where Bogart and Sam, it's late at night, and he's like, play that song, and he's like, if she can handle it, I can handle it. So he's like using this music as like a soothing um, device in a way,
Yeah.
accessing memories, but also comforting, like kind of bittersweet memories. So I think it's a really smart use of a soundtrack, or like a score, the way
Yeah.
that's done. And
Absolutely.
the song is called "As Time Goes By" in real life. That's what
There it is. Yeah.
"As Time Goes By," and it's a very catchy tune. I mean, it was like,
Hmm.
and it's older than this film. Actually, it's from, like, I'm looking it up now, from 1931. So it was already a well-known song, but it became really well-known after this movie.
Nice. I love it. Yeah. It is cool how it's used to sort of like trigger a flashback, because I feel like for me, music is like the closest thing that we have to, I'll say, like internal time travel. Like you hear a song that was something that you listened to during a particular moment in your life, and you're sort of like, it's really, I think with music more so than other things, it's really easy to then be like emotionally transplanted back to that time. Um, and also just like think about where you are emotionally now as opposed to then. And I think that's like exactly what happens for the Rick character. So it is kind of this like, he's experiencing that flashback, and like all of those emotions sort of wash over him of when he was in Paris when he hears the song. But it is also like a cheeky tool of filmmaking to
Mhm.
allow us as audience members to go to that place with him, um, in a
Yeah.
way that also like just like serves the story. So it is a, yeah, absolutely great device within the movie.
Hmm.
Jason, was there anything else that we haven't brought up yet about Casablanca that you wanted to talk about?
I'm Well, there's a famous quote by the writer William Faulkner, when he won the Nobel Prize, and when he gave his speech, he said that great writing, literature, and you could apply this to film too. Great writing is when the human heart is in conflict with itself. And I really think that that line is embodied in Rick's character. I mean, he like exemplifies exactly that.
Yeah.
He knows what the right thing is, but he also is a human being with his own, like emotions to deal with. And he's, sometimes you know what the right thing to do is, but you're also like hurt because of something that's personal to you, and you're not able to do what's right. And that's really exemplified so well in this film. And I think that's why it has so much staying power, among other things.
Yeah.
Uh,
I mean,
yeah.
I think that is probably the biggest thing that that allows this movie to sort of, live on throughout time, is how easy it is to connect with Rick as a character, and like how
Mm-hmm.
universal that theme is of like, I think we all in our own ways have very particular worldviews and like ideals of how the world around us should and could operate. But a lot of times our lived experiences, whether it be romantic or otherwise, can cause us to like question those thoughts and like whether or not it's worth the struggle of fighting for those other things when you feel like personally unable to move past whatever it is that you're dealing with within your own life. So I mean, I don't know that if like people are watching this movie and like necessarily going to that place mentally, but I think it is very much so in play with audiences throughout time, and part of why it connects with so many people.
Yeah. Well, I've seen a lot of film noir films from this era, and
Mm-hmm.
very rarely do you get depth of character this far, because a lot of it is surface level motivated actions, but you never really get deep, nuanced views of characters. I mean, you do sometimes,
Yeah.
but and I think that's just what makes it a standout picture film, among other things. It's also just really the bar is, I'm impressed the way that they built that set, because it's all made in a Hollywood set, and the way the camera moves from little micro worlds in that thing. They'll have a conversation,
Yeah.
the camera moves over to another conversation, and all these like things are going on at once, and it's really interesting the way that they handle that. I mean, it's really well done.
Yeah, it is great. It doesn't feel like it's like you're just like on a studio lot.
Mm-hmm.
When you watch this movie, you do fully feel like you've been transported to Casablanca and
Yeah.
Rick's Cafe, and it
Mm-hmm.
feels like a very real, lived-in place
Mm-hmm.
that has like so much rich energy and um, like all of that just about it. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
absolutely delightful movie, a must watch for any film lover, or just film curious person, I would say. Even if you don't call yourself like all the way like a cinephile, if you're just a little curious about movies, definitely a film worth checking out. Jason, thank you for joining for this conversation. This has been an absolute blast. It's been
Oh,
great.
thank you. It was my pleasure. I loved it. It's always fun to nerd out and talk for a long time about a movie.
Yeah. Especially a movie as great as Casablanca.
Yeah.
Before we get out of here and wrap things up all the way, we'll do some recommendations for any new listeners that we might have out there, or if anyone just needs a reminder, I will quickly run through what it is that we do with recommendations. So for each movie that we introduce into the canon, we also recommend 3 things per guest host, for other things to check out. Of those 3 things, at least one has to be another movie. The other 2, however, can be any and everything else. It could be books, a TV show, an album, a video game, board game, a painting, an art museum, a restaurant, really like to get super creative. The connections to the movie can be as loose or on the nose as we like. Again, we like to get creative. We like to have a lot of fun with it. The only rules for any movies that we recommend, they can't be movies that are already in the canon. So, no, I can't think of anything, but the movies that are out there, anything that we've done an episode on or that you've seen an article write up on the website, none of those movies, and a strict 3 and only 3 limit. So sometimes we get folks who like to do a 2-for-1 or a 3-for-1, and they're really recommending 4 or 5 things. Unfortunately, we have to keep it to 3. Otherwise, we'd be here all day. So Jason will go back and forth. You'll give your first recommendation, a brief overview for why it is that you're recommending it, and then I'll give my first one, and then your second, so on and so forth.
Sounds good. All mine are going to be movies.
Nice.
My first, and I hope this isn't on your list. I don't think it is, but my first one is To Be or Not to Be. Came out the same year, 1942, directed by Ernst Lubitsch.
Nice.
It is an absolutely brilliant, funny masterpiece. I mean, it's a top 50 for me, probably, of all time.
Nice.
And it's also about the Nazis. It's set in Poland, and it's about an acting troupe. And, it's same year, 1942. And, the Nazis occupied France, but they also occupied Poland. And what it's about is a bunch of actors suddenly find themselves in occupied Poland, and they decide to portray themselves as Nazis to get into to basically to save their own skin and to do other things. And it's just unbelievably smart and bold. And really, have you seen it?
I haven't seen it. No, I just wrote it down. I have to add that to my watch list.
Yeah, you will be shocked at how good it is. You'll be blown away by this movie.
Awesome. I love it. I love one of my favorite things about recommendations is like I get so many movies to add to my watch list.
And Ernst Lubitsch is funny. He's really known for his clever dialogue, and he's the guy who made Design for Living and a bunch of famous kind of pre-code movies. But anyway, yeah.
Awesome. I love that. I definitely have to check that movie out. For my first recommendation, I also have 3 movies because, we're movie freaks, and the only way that we can think about the world is through movies. Well, maybe I won't say that for you, but that's definitely true for me. So the first movie that I'm going to recommend is another movie about a guy who has a sort of lost love from the past come back into his life and really shake up his world. I think this guy's world gets shooken up in ways that are different from how Rick's world, ends up being shaken up. But I'm recommending from 1947, Out of the Past. Great Robert Mitchum movie. Also featuring a very young Kirk Douglas, which is awesome. But
that's a good movie. I agree.
Very solid flick.
Yeah, nice. So is it back to me?
Back to you.
Okay. It was so hard to narrow this down. Well, this might be in your canon, but I don't think it is. A movie that's often compared to Casablanca, and sometimes considered a remake of Casablanca, which it's not, but it's a really good film called To Have and Have Not.
Nice.
So it came out.
A lot of two oars in your.
Yeah, I know. So To Be or Not to Be, and To Have and Have Not. So this is from 1944. So still set during World War II, and it's directed by Howard Hawks. and it's just a fantastic. Also starring Humphrey Bogart,
Hmm.
and just an amazing film. And it's loosely based on a Ernest Hemingway novel with the same name. But and essentially, this is the film. I believe that it's starring Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall, and I'm pretty sure that this is when they met each other, and then they ended up getting falling in love and getting married. So this was like the start of their romance in real life. And
They're Mr. and Mrs. Smith.
Yeah, yeah. Lauren Bacall is just very magnetic, and Bogart is Bogart. So this is the other great Bogart film that's some very similar themes, and it's shot kind of. It's got more on the street scenes and on the beach, and it's not so claustrophobic in terms of its setting. It's very good. I would recommend that.
Awesome. I love that. That is not in our canon. And also another movie for me to add to my watch list.
Yeah.
I love it. Okay, cool. For my second recommendation, something that I mentioned sort of near the end, but Rick's as a location sort of being a stand-in for the US and having all of these different sort of clashing forces of ideologies and like worldviews and all this different stuff sort of coming together in one place. I feel like another movie that does that in a very interesting way is 1939 Stagecoach. Instead of being within a bar, there are just
Hmm.
all of these different, like I said, ideologies and stuff that are clashing with each other in the back of a stagecoach. Kind of the only really connection point between the two movies, but I did think that was kind of like, if you're looking for a double feature, that's kind of like dealing with that element of American culture. I think those two are playing with it in a pretty interesting way.
Yeah. I've seen that movie, but it's been a long time, and I really should. I need to just go on a deep dive of John Ford at some point and see all the stuff that he's made.
Yeah.
I've seen several, but there's a lot I haven't seen. I have seen this one, but it's been a while. That's a great recommendation. Oh man, so hard, so much pressure. So my final film that I'm recommending is, I think it's criminally underseen, and people need to see this movie. It's called Mr. Klein. It was made in 1976, so a little bit later, directed by Joseph Losey. And our first episode of our podcast is about a Joseph Losey film. So he was blacklisted. He was one of these Americans who was blacklisted, and to save his career, he moved to England. And the rest of
Hmm.
his life, he lived in England, and he made all of his films in Europe, mostly in England. But this one's set in Paris, and it stars Alain Delon, who just died. The famous French heartthrob
Yeah.
Alain Delon. And what it's about is, uh, it's about a man who is it's, well, in real life, what happened during the when the Nazis occupied France. One day they sent an order for all the Jewish people in France or in Paris to show up, and they put them all in boxcars and sent them to Auschwitz. That's just what happened. And so it's a movie about that, but
Hmm.
Mr. the actor, Mr. I mean the title character, this guy named Monsieur Klein, he's this wealthy art collector, and he gets caught up in this crazy mystery. It's a case of mistaken identity. I don't want to give too much away, but it's a really
Hmm.
good film that I was shocked how good it was and how original it is. And it's not seen enough, I feel like. So that's my
Yeah.
recommendation.
I hadn't heard of it. So
And
three.
Joseph Losey is a great director.
I love
So
it.
anyway.
Yeah, three for three in terms of movies that I'm adding to my watch list.
Nice.
I love it. So my last recommendation is probably not something that people are going to be adding to their watch list, which is totally fine, but a movie that I just like, those like guilty, not even guilty. No, I guess it is a guilty pleasure. Those guilty pleasure movies that you just can't sort of shake, but they, for some reason, sort of like latch onto you and become something that you very much so identify with as, being part of your, like my personal makeup of, my favorite movies or movies that are essential to me. This is another movie, a more recent movie that is also about, love lost and a guy who has to let the girl go because of how deeply he loves her. If you love something, set it free, it'll come back or whatever. Sometimes it won't. And I think in the case of Casablanca, we know that Ilsa's not coming back. Another movie where it's the case that, she's not coming back is 2016's La La Land. I adore that movie. And I'm often embarrassed to say it, but to me, that is like a movie that just like hit me at the right time in my life, where it has like stuck with me in ways that not a lot of movies do. And there is some connection between, or I feel some like thematic through lines between Casablanca and La La Land.
So here's where I admit I actually haven't seen it. I haven't seen La La Land. There's like I hardly watch any new movies, and I
Yeah.
know that's not that new now, but yeah, I need to see it. You just convinced me it's going on my watch list.
Yeah.
My wife
It's,
loves that movie. She's a fan, so that's good to know.
it's, I mean, I get why it's hit or miss for some people, but
Hmm.
for me, I think it struck a chord and I have not been able to shake it. So
Nice.
that's
I
my
will.
that's my third recommendation.
I
And I
will watch
shouldn't be embarrassed. There's no need to be embarrassed by the
it.
movies that we love.
It was celebrated by a lot of people. I just haven't seen it for some reason.
Yeah,
I need to.
sweet. So I've got one to add to your watch list.
Yeah, yeah. What was the first one you named? I already forgot.
Out of the Past.
Oh, Out of the Past. Yeah, that's a great movie.
Yeah. So just in case anyone wants to write down what our recommendations were and add them to their watch list, let's just quickly go through them. So Jason, give your three movies that you're recommending.
Yeah, the three were To Be or Not to Be, 1942. To Have and Have Not from 1944, and Mr. Klein from 1976.
Amazing. And I've got Out of the Past from 1947, Stagecoach from 1939, and La La Land from 2016. Uh, amazing. We did it. We talked Casablanca. It's an essential movie. Jason, thank you so much again for joining.
It was my
Well,
pleasure. I really appreciate it.
yeah, this was a great conversation. Listeners, I hope you all enjoyed. We will be back next week with another essential movie. But before we get into that, just so you know, obviously you can continue to listen to us here at the Canon wherever it is that you're listening to us now. Might be Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google, Amazon. You might be following along on our YouTube page that is has been up and running for a while now. So check us out in all those places. Also, definitely continue to check out the website proper at screenagewasteland.com. Ton of great articles coming out, all across there. We've got a ton of different stuff going on. We're creeping up on spooky season. October is right around the corner, so there will definitely be a lot of really good Halloween related content going up on the website. We will start to do some Halloween related movies here on the Canon, definitely within October. But for next week, we're sort of like dipping our toes into something kind of horror related. We're going to be talking Under the Skin. Really, really great movie. If you haven't seen it, highly recommend checking that out, giving that movie a watch so that you can join us next week for our conversation about that. We hope to see you there. And in the meantime, we'll see you in the wasteland.